Hi, Mark Jones here again with Crime Chronicles, this time coming to you from beautiful San Juan, Puerto Rico. On this episode, we take a look at two events, actually. Let's start with November 1st, 1950. Harry S. Truman, President of the United States, was at a temporary residence at the Blair House across the street from the White House while the White House is undergoing renovation. Two men approached White House police officers and opened fire in an attempt to assassinate President Harry S. Truman. The president was not hurt. However, one police officer was killed, as was one of the assassins. The other assassin was wounded, as were some police officers. Now, in this episode, we'll explain what San Juan, Puerto Rico, the connection between San Juan and the attempted assassination of President Truman, on this edition of Crime Chronicles. Puerto Rico has had a fractious relationship with the American mainland since the United States forcibly annexed the island in 1898. To understand the Jayuya Uprising and the 1950 attempt to assassinate President Harry Truman, one must understand the history of Puerto Rico, its relationship with the United States, and its equally dysfunctional history with several European powers, especially Spain. Well, in order to understand what happened with President Truman back in 1950, one has to go back several hundred years in the history of Puerto Rico. In 1493, or so thereabouts, Christopher Columbus settled here and named this island San Juan Bautista, or St. John the Baptist. Now, the Taínos, the people who had lived here for thousands of years, made the mistake of telling Columbus and his Spanish colleagues that there were minerals here on the island. Now, actually, the island of Puerto Rico is not really that rich in minerals, but tell that to Spanish explorers. Well, as a result of this rumor, or that there was these minerals on the island, the name of the island was changed from San Juan Bautista to Puerto Rico, or Rich Port. In fact, Puerto Rico today has very rich ports, very fine natural ports, and therefore it has always been the object of exploitation and exploration by European powers and powers in the Western Hemisphere. Well, as the years went on, the Spanish conquered or settled, however one chooses to look at it, Puerto Rico. The Taínos, those who survived the diseases brought by the Spaniards, were taken into slavery for the most part and exploited for labor. And for about 400 years, Puerto Rico was under the domination, mostly of the Spanish, but somewhat by the Dutch and by the English. Around the mid-19th century, the move for Puerto Rican independence really took shape. And it was around 1897 that Spain finally decided to grant Puerto Rico almost total independence. But that almost total independence was disrupted in 1898 when the United States went to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War. Throughout the centuries that the island was dominated by European powers, Puerto Ricans developed their own culture and identity, and like other countries in the Western Hemisphere, wanted independence from their mother country, Spain. The Puerto Rican independence movement began in earnest in 1868, and after almost 30 years of struggle, in 1897, Spain granted almost complete autonomy to Puerto Rico. But as I said in the video, the autonomy was short-lived. After only 1 year of virtual independence, the United States declared war on Spain and invaded Puerto Rico. The Spanish-American War of 1898, which was fought mostly in Cuba and the Philippines, lasted only a few weeks. The United States marked its emergence as a world power by vanquishing the Spanish from Puerto Rico and Cuba. Long coveted by American business, political, and military interests, Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory. Puerto Ricans traded their Spanish rulers for American ones. American business and political interests wasted no time in exploiting the island's resources and its people. The result of the Spanish-American War in 1898, which is very brief, was that the United States acquired several new territories, including Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Now, a lot of Americans were very uncomfortable with the idea of acquiring territory in this way. They thought that was something European powers did, but nevertheless, the United States took control of Puerto Rico and made it a U.S. territory. But the citizens here were not citizens of the United States, had no voting rights. Puerto Rico was designated a U.S. territory, but its inhabitants were not United States citizens, as Puerto Rico was inhabited by, quote, alien races, unquote. Puerto Ricans would elect their own legislature and one U.S. congressional representative who could observe and speak but could not vote. The domination and exploitation of Puerto Rico by the United States was not confined to business interests. In fact, Spanish was banned in government dealings and in schools. Students were forced to learn English, teachers were forced to teach English, even though most teachers did not even speak English themselves. In the early 20th century, the United States passed a law called the Foraker Act, named after its sponsor, Robert Foraker, which banned the teaching of Spanish in schools in Puerto Rico. It banned the Spanish in all government and business dealings. And in fact, the insult, if you will, to the Puerto Rican people continued, even in pronunciation and spelling of the name. Now, it's a bit difficult for Anglos like me to let the words Puerto Rico roll off the tongue. Instead, it's much easier for Americans to say Puerto Rico. Understandable. But the spelling was different, though. The spelling was, in fact, supposed to be Puerto, which it is now, but government officials in government dealings thought so little of the Puerto Rican language and knew so little about the Puerto Rican people, it was spelled Puerto Rico, P-R-R-T-O. In 1902, the Official Language Act mandated that English become co-equal with Spanish in all official dealings and in schools, even though practically no students and very few teachers could speak English. Puerto Rican students were required to salute the American flag and sing the national anthem in English. Spanish was banned in public schools in 1909. The exploitation of the Puerto Rican people at the hands of the U.S. government took form in its governorship. The first governor appointed by President William McKinley was Charles Allen, and he and other American business interests profited greatly from Puerto Rico, primarily in the sugar industry. In fact, what is now Domino Sugar was started here in Puerto Rico by U.S. government officials. The first territorial governor, Charles Allen, made himself treasurer and president of the American Sugar Refining Company and became one of the biggest sugar magnates in the world for a company that eventually changed its name to Domino Sugar. In 1922, the United States Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice and former President William Taft, declared Puerto Rico a territory. Puerto Ricans had no rights under the Constitution, including collective bargaining or a guaranteed minimum wage. Thousands of Puerto Ricans worked for poor wages for American companies. Puerto Rican banks were largely controlled by American business interests. By the 1930s, about one-half of all arable land in Puerto Rico had been converted into sugar plantations, and U.S. business interests controlled 80% of Puerto Rican sugar production. Another reason the United States government coveted Puerto Rico was because of its strategic location. It is situated very well between islands in the Caribbean, particularly Cuba, and South America. Therefore, it is very strategic in terms of intelligence gathering and in terms of naval presence. It was not until 1917 that Puerto Ricans gained U.S. citizenship, but they were still denied the right to vote. Now, the reason they were granted citizenship was simple. The United States in 1917 was embroiled in World War I and needed Puerto Ricans to help fight the battle overseas. In 1917, Congress passed the Jones Act, which granted citizenship but not voting rights to Puerto Ricans. Citizenship allowed Puerto Rican men to be drafted into service for World War I. One young man who volunteered for service would become the face of Puerto Rican nationalism, a 5'4" Harvard-educated lawyer named Pedro Abizio Campos. One young Puerto Rican who helped the United States in World War I was a man named Pedro Abizio Campos. Now, Campos was born to a Puerto Rican mother and a Basque father who never claimed his son. He was raised in poverty. He was illiterate until he was about 13 years old, but he passed 8 grades in about 4 years. Pedro Abizio Campos, or El Maestro, the teacher, was born September 12, 1891 in Ponce, Puerto Rico. He was born out of wedlock to Juliana Campos, a mestizo Puerto Rican, and Don Alejandro Abizio Romero. Romero was a wealthy merchant from the Basque region of Spain who refused to acknowledge or support his dark-skinned son. Juliana committed suicide, leaving Pedro to be raised by an aunt, but he spent most of his childhood roaming the streets of Ponce. He did not attend school until age 12, but he completed 8 grades in 4 years, eventually becoming valedictorian of his Ponce High School class. Pedro Albizu Campos was so smart that he did something very rare for the time, in the early 20th century. He gained admission to the University of Vermont. He did so well at University of Vermont that he became the first Puerto Rican to be admitted to Harvard Law School. But his studies at Harvard were interrupted by World War I. Albizu Campos volunteered for service in the Army and was commissioned as first lieutenant. He spent most of his military service in Puerto Rico, leading the 3rd Battalion Infantry. Pedro Albizu Campos thrived at Harvard Law School. In fact, he finished at the top of his class. Rather than take a job that paid very well, Pedro Albizu Campos realized that no matter how hard he tried, this dark-skinned man from the Caribbean would never fit in with mainstream American society. So he returned to his native Puerto Rico, mostly surviving on pro bono work or free work, and advocating, slowly but surely, for Puerto Rican independence from the United States. Pedro Albizu Campos married his wife Laura in 1922. They would have 3 children. Albizu Campos spent the 1920s and early 1930s advocating for Puerto Rican independence. A charismatic speaker, he was elected president of the National Party of Puerto Rico in 1930. Puerto Rican nationalism gained traction during the Great Depression of the 1930s, especially when American sugar bosses reduced wages for Puerto Rican manual laborers. Strikes broke out periodically, and business interests took notice of Albizu Campos. So did J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. Hoover suspected that Albizu Campos was controlled by Latin American communists. Throughout his 48-year tenure as FBI director, the Mercurial Hoover suspected almost anyone that did not fit his ideal of what an American should be of being a communist. In 1932, Albizu Campos discovered a letter written by Cornelius Rhodes, an American physician who had worked in Puerto Rico. Rhodes called Puerto Ricans the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate, and thievish race of men ever inhabiting this sphere, and wrote that he had done his best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more Puerto Ricans. Rhodes claimed that he wrote the letter in anger and that his statements were not true, which was probably indeed the case. But the damage was done. Well, in the 1930s, things were bad around the world because of the Great Depression. Puerto Rico was also greatly affected by the Great Depression. And in fact, things got much worse and things got much violent. In the mid-1930s, a retired Army colonel was assassinated by Puerto Rican nationalists. Pedro Albizu Campos was linked to this assassination. He was sentenced to over 10 years in prison. He refused release in 1941 because he refused to promise he would not take action against the United States government and advocate for Puerto Rican independence. So he stayed in prison until 1946 and 1947. And then he was released, returned to a hero's welcome in Puerto Rico. However, he was still discouraged. The fervor for Puerto Rican independence had died somewhat. Things had improved here. President Harry Truman treated Puerto Ricans much better than his predecessors had. But Albizu Campos and his Confederates were not satisfied. More was needed. A spark was needed to ignite the drive for Puerto Rican independence. Albizu Campos served most of his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Despite constant monitoring, he managed to have letters advocating the Puerto Rican cause published. He rejected an offer of early release in 1941 rather than renounce his nationalist activities. Albizu Campos was released in 1943 and lived in New York City until December 1947 when he returned to Puerto Rico. Although he was met with a hero's welcome upon his return to Puerto Rico, Albizu Campos was dismayed that nationalist sentiment had subsided in Puerto Rico. The majority of Puerto Ricans seemed content with the status quo, made even better by President Harry Truman, who had done more for Puerto Ricans than his predecessors. President Truman visited Puerto Rico in 1948, appointed the first native Puerto Rican to be the governor, and was gradually allowing Puerto Ricans more autonomy. And while the island was still poor compared to most American states, health conditions, economic conditions, and Puerto Rican infrastructure were improving. But in the minds of Puerto Rican nationalists like Albizu Campos, there was no such thing as benevolent foreign occupation. Albizu Campos thought a spark was needed to reignite Puerto Rican nationalism. It would come in October 1950. The spark for Puerto Rican independence that people like Pedro Albizu Campos wanted came the last weekend in October 1950. It was known as the Jayuya Uprising. An uprising started in several Puerto Rican cities, including San Juan, Ponce, larger cities, and Jayuya. On Monday, October 30th, 1950, Puerto Rican nationalists staged uprisings in several Puerto Rican cities. Dozens of nationalists and police officers were killed in the revolt. Governor Luis Muñoz Martin declared martial law. Two Puerto Rican cities, Jayuya and Utuado, were bombed and machine gunned from the sky, the only time in history that the American military has bombed its own citizens from the air. Nationalists burned the post office in Jayuya, shot police officers, and raised the Puerto Rican flag. The revolt failed, and dozens of nationalists were arrested, including Pedro Albizu Campos, who kept authorities at bay in a standoff at his house for hours, but finally surrendered. News of the Jayuya uprising reached the U.S. mainland through the news media. There was a large Puerto Rican community living in New York City at the time, and two men who lived there were 37-year-old Oscar Collazo and 25-year-old Rosario Torresolo. Now, these men, like many Puerto Ricans, were monitoring events going on down here. Many had family down here. In fact, one of those men had a sister who was arrested and wounded in the uprising. They decided they could not sit on their hands any longer, and they must go to Puerto Rico to join in this fight. But Oscar Collazo had a different idea. Oscar Collazo and Rosario Torresolo had known each other for years but were not close friends. Oscar Collazo was born on January 20th, 1914 in Florida, Puerto Rico, and was involved in Puerto Rican nationalism his entire life. He became a fervent Pedro Albizu Campos follower after meeting him in 1932. Collazo moved to New York City in 1941, joining the large Puerto Rican community there. He worked at a metal polishing factory and by all accounts was hardworking and amiable. His wife, Rose, was also involved in nationalist activities, but they lived a normal family life in the Puerto Rican community in New York City. Rosario Torresolo was born July 19, 1925, in Jayuya, Puerto Rico, to a family with a lifelong commitment to Puerto Rican nationalism. Torresolo married Delia Rivera while both were in their teens and had one child. He and his wife separated, but unknown to Torresolo, never officially divorced. He moved to New York City in 1948 and primarily subsisted on a $129 welfare check, which he used to support his new common-law wife, Carmen Otero, with whom he had two children. He knew Pedro Albizu Campos well. A letter written by Albizu Campos indicates that Albizu Campos anointed him de facto leader of the Puerto Rican nationalist movement in the United States. Around 9 p.m. on October 29, 1950, Torresolo went to Collazo's New York City apartment and proposed that they join the uprising in Puerto Rico. Collazo agreed to go, but he had no weapon. He gave Torresolo $50 to buy a weapon for him, and they parted ways. The next day, October 30th, news of the uprising in Puerto Rico reached New York. Torresolo's sister, Doris Torresolo Rora, was wounded in San Juan and was arrested. The Puerto Rican community in New York City was abuzz, with many going in and out of the Torresolo home to share and receive news about the uprising. Torresolo paid another visit to Collazo. Collazo was dismayed that the American news media was not mentioning that the real grievance was against the government of the United States. President Truman dismissed the uprising as a Puerto Rican problem. Collazo convinced Torresolo that the only way for Americans to take notice of Puerto Rico was to make a statement on the American mainland, and that the best way to do that would be an attempted assassination of President Truman, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. Collazo and Torresolo told their wives they were going to Puerto Rico to join the uprising. While they knew this news would be upsetting to their wives, they knew that the truth was far worse. No doubt they wanted their wives to have plausible deniability of the plot as well. Before they left, both men purchased new business suits, dress shirts, ties, and hats, thinking that nice clothes would make them look less suspicious. Torresolo and Collazo purchased one-way train tickets to Washington and journeyed together. When 25-year-old Rosario Torresolo talked to 37-year-old Oscar Collazo about joining the Jayuya uprising, Collazo had a better idea, at least he thought. After all, the Jayuya uprising was just another Puerto Rican problem. What they had to do was make a statement that would be heard on the U.S. mainland. And what better way to make a statement than to try to assassinate the President of the United States? Who was Harry Truman, and how did he attain the presidency? Harry S. Truman was born on May 8, 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, the son of John Truman, a farmer, and Martha Truman. His middle initial did not stand for a middle name, but was an homage to his grandfathers, both of whose names began with S. Harry spent most of his childhood in Independence, Missouri. Harry Truman is the last president to not have a college degree. Even though he was legally blind in one eye, Truman memorized the eye chart that allowed him entry into the Missouri National Guard. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, he was commissioned as first lieutenant for a field artillery unit and was eventually promoted to captain. A decorated commander, Truman participated in one of the war's bloodiest battles, the Argonne Offensive. Upon returning to Missouri after the war, he married Elizabeth Bess Wallace, whom he had been courting for almost a decade and who he would always affectionately refer to as the boss. They would have one daughter, Margaret. Truman was elected county judge or county commissioner for Jackson County, Missouri in 1922. He lost his re-election bid in 1924, but won it back in 1926 and remained a county judge until 1935. Harry Truman was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1934 and re-elected in 1940. Truman was popular with his Senate colleagues, but did not establish himself as a national figure. As World War II wound down in late 1944, President Roosevelt, in a bid for a fourth term, tagged Senator Truman as his running mate. Truman reluctantly accepted the nomination, knowing the vice presidency is often an empty position, and the Roosevelt-Truman ticket won the election. It was not well known in early 1945 that President Roosevelt was in poor health. During his 82 days as vice president, the two men met face-to-face just twice, and Truman was not privy to several projects underway, including the atomic bomb experiments in New Mexico. When President Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, America was still at war. Americans were mortified at the thought of being led by an obscure senator like Harry Truman from Missouri after 12 years of living under a giant on the world stage like Franklin Roosevelt. Truman realized the gravity of his task, saying, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." German surrender, or VE, Victory in Europe Day, came on May 8th, but war was still raging in Asia when Truman learned of the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb in July. An Allied invasion of Japan was looming, and Truman was told to expect up to 500,000 Allied casualties. Japan refused a final call to surrender, and in a decision that will be debated for time immemorial, President Truman made the decision to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. A second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan surrendered on August 10, 1945. Harry Truman is the only leader in world history to authorize the use of atomic weapons. With an approval rate under 40%, Truman was given little chance against his Republican opponent, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, in his 1948 election bid. In one of the greatest political upsets in U.S. history, Truman defeated Dewey, much to the dismay of a Chicago newspaper that prematurely declared Dewey the winner. The greatest crisis of the Truman presidency started in 1950. When World War II ended in 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States divided the Korean peninsula along the 30th parallel into Communist North Korea, dominated by the Soviet Union, and South Korea, which housed thousands of American troops. In June 1950, North Korea, led by its founding leader Kim Il-sung, invaded South Korea. At Truman's urging, the United Nations made its first foray into military combat, with 21 countries assisting the United States in its fight against North Korea. The Korean conflict experienced a major shift in November 1950, when Chinese forces, authorized by Communist leader Mao Zedong, entered the war on the side of North Korea. As casualties mounted, Truman's approval rating plummeted, reaching a low of 22% in 1952. Truman's popularity suffered when he fired General Douglas MacArthur from his duties in Korea, saying that MacArthur had become insubordinate and risked a greater war with China. The Korean conflict would remain a stalemate until an armistice was signed in 1953 by Truman's successor, Dwight Eisenhower. But the assassination attempt against President Truman on November 1, 1950, had nothing to do with the Korean conflict or his performance as president. He happened to be the man occupying the presidency, and the president, not Truman himself, was a symbolic target. While the Jayuya Uprising was going on here in Puerto Rico the last weekend in October, Oscar Collazo and Rosario Torresolo told their wives they were going to Puerto Rico to join the fight. However, what they really had in mind was something else. They boarded a train in New York City and went to Washington, D.C. with the intention of assassinating President Truman. Now, neither man was exactly a skilled assassin. In fact, Oscar Collazo had never fired a weapon in his entire life. October 31st, 1950, Torresolo and Collazo arrive in Washington, D.C. and check into a hotel. They take a taxi and peruse the White House, trying to stake out their prey, if you will, and then they return back to their hotel. On November 1st, 1950, Oscar Collazo and Rosario Torresolo get in another taxi cab. This time they're told by the taxi driver, who's unsuspecting, of course, that President Truman is not staying at the White House. The White House is undergoing renovation. President Truman is staying across the street at the Blair House. The Blair House is not very well protected and very close to the street. Very fortuitous, if you will, for these would-be assassins. Well, after discovering that President Truman was staying at the Blair House and not the White House, and knowing now that the Blair House was much more vulnerable and a much softer target, the two men returned to their hotel. It was there that Rosario Torresolo taught Oscar Collazo how to use his weapon. Oscar Collazo had never fired a pistol in his entire life. When Collazo and Torresolo arrived in Washington on October 31st, they went to the Harris Hotel on Massachusetts Avenue. Since they were not familiar with Washington, they took a taxi and asked the driver to take them to the White House. But the cab driver informed them that the president was not staying at the White House, but at the Blair House, which he pointed out to them. The cab driver later said the two men were so small, both under 5'5", and slightly built, seemed so non-threatening that they seemed like divinity students. The next morning, November 1st, after breakfast, Collazo and Torresolo perused the area again. Another cab driver dropped them off near the White House. They spent the next couple of hours inconspicuously observing the Blair House, noting the lax security and how close the Blair House was to the street. They had no idea of President Truman's schedule. They had lunch and returned to their hotel, where Torresolo taught Collazo how to use his pistol. They took another taxi, this time getting off at Lafayette Park or Lafayette Square, across the street from the White House. Now the scene for the Truman assassination attempt shifts to Washington, D.C. Now it's a beautiful day right now. It's a little cool though. It's much cooler here than it is in Puerto Rico on most days, and it's much cooler than it was on November 1st, 1950. On the 1st of November 1950, it was unseasonably warm, like 85 degrees. And we're standing here in a place called Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., just down the street from the Blair House. This is where the two assassins met and decided to deploy, if you will, very simply. One would cross the street and the other would stay here, and they would converge on the Blair House at the same time. This is where the attempt occurred, and it just so happens we're here on a day when they paid tribute to police officer Leslie Cofield, who died in the attempt against President Truman. This is the Blair House in back of me. Now, to my left is where Oscar Collazo charged the steps to the Blair House, but was shot and dropped by a Secret Service agent. But of course, Collazo survived. It was approximately 2:15 p.m. Collazo, who still had never fired his weapon, approached White House police officer Donald Birdsell. For some reason, the nearsighted Collazo was not wearing his eyeglasses, but had them in his pocket. Collazo and Torresolo converged right here, and Collazo was so inexperienced with weapons, he had never fired one before. He took his pistol out, aimed it at a police officer. The pistol did not go off. He had forgotten to take the safety off the pistol. So Oscar Collazo proceeds to beat his leg with the pistol, causing it to discharge and strike a police officer in the leg. But the police officer survived. Collazo charges the steps of the Blair House, intent on going in, but he was shot and dropped by a Secret Service agent. As you can tell from the memorial here, Officer Leslie Cofield was not so fortunate. The other assassin, Rosario Torresolo, was more skilled with weapons. He shot Officer Cofield, fatally wounding him. But Officer Cofield, before he died, was able to return fire, shot Torresolo in the ear, and Torresolo died instantly. But Rosario Torresolo had begun opening fire with deadly accuracy. He hit Officer Leslie Cofield with 3 shots, and shot Officer Joseph Downs 3 times as well. While Torresolo paused to reload, Cofield got off a shot of his own, striking Torresolo in his right ear and killing him instantly. As Collazo approached the Blair House entrance, he was met by Secret Service agent Vincent Moroz, who dropped him with a shot to the chest. Collazo collapsed in front of the Blair House entrance, while Torresolo lay dead a few feet away. Leslie Cofield died a few hours later. Where was President Truman at this time? Now, the assassins didn't even know, actually. But it turned out that President Truman was taking his customary afternoon nap here at the Blair House, probably on the 2nd or 3rd floor. Now, according to some people, President Truman went to the window, looked out to see what the commotion that was going on, but someone, a police officer or an agent of some sort, supposedly yelled at the president to go back inside. Neither Collazo nor Torresolo was aware that President Truman, hearing the gunshots, got out of his bed from his customary afternoon nap and went to the window to have a look. It is unlikely that Collazo was a skilled enough marksman to have shot the president, but Torresolo might have had better luck. By some accounts, Truman stuck his head out the window and was told to get back and was later chided by the Secret Service for going to the window in the first place. By other accounts, it was someone else who stuck his head out a window. President Truman proceeded with his planned visit to Arlington Cemetery that day. He later remarked that, quote, a president has to accept these things, and claimed, hell, if they made it up the steps, I'd have made them eat those guns. And the only thing you have to worry about is bad luck. I never have bad luck. Privately, Truman was shaken, especially at the death of Officer Kofeld, who sacrificed his life to protect him. He said that he would not let the ordeal affect his habits, but at the urging of the Secret Service and his wife and daughter, Truman, who once said the White House is the finest prison in the world, took greater precautions from that point on, including being driven to the White House and the Blair House rather than walking. Oscar Collazo was treated at a local hospital and questioned. His wife Rosa was arrested in New York and charged with attempting to overthrow the government. Rosa would spend 8 months in confinement, but was released when it became evident she had no prior knowledge of the incident. Wasting little time in dispensing justice, Oscar Collazo went on trial on February 26, 1951. He was outraged when it was suggested he enter an insanity plea. Collazo was convinced the insanity angle was hatched by Puerto Rican government officials, and he angrily rejected any attempt at pleading insanity. Collazo wanted the public to view his cause as rational, and not to view him as a mentally ill assassin. Health experts found no evidence of mental illness. Although he never apologized for his actions, Collazo stated, I never had any feeling of hatred or dislike for Mr. Truman or any other American or anybody else for that matter. Collazo may have been telling the truth, or he may have been parsing words. He said he did it for political reasons, so my country will be free. We decided to start a revolution. I did not come down here to shoot Mr. Truman. I came here to kill the President of the United States. Collazo's trial ended on March 7th, less than 2 weeks after it started. No one except Collazo testified for the defense. The jury only took a few hours to find him guilty. A death sentence was mandatory. While Rosa Collazo and other Puerto Ricans publicly campaigned for a sentence commutation, Oscar Collazo did not beg for his life. President Truman received entreaties from the Puerto Rican government and other leaders throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. Their message was not to make Oscar Collazo a martyr, which would generate anti-government uprisings throughout the Western Hemisphere. On July 24, 1951, President Truman, without comment, commuted Collazo's sentence to life imprisonment. As for those who survived the ordeal, all of the wounded police officers returned to duty. Harry Truman did not run for another term in 1952 and was succeeded by Republican Dwight Eisenhower. Truman retired to his home in Missouri, where he remained until his death on December 26, 1972. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter, courting the Puerto Rican vote in New York for his unsuccessful re-election bid in the 1980 presidential election, commuted Oscar Collazo's sentence to time served. He returned to a hero's welcome in Puerto Rico, where he lived the rest of his life. He died in 1994. Collazo never expressed remorse. Now, Pedro Abizio Campos had no direct connection to this assassination and knew nothing about this. However, it was symptomatic of the kind of work that he and his people did here in Puerto Rico. So it didn't take Puerto Rican authorities long to arrest Abizio Campos, who had also been arrested in the Jayuya uprising anyway, and put him in custody and put him on trial for crimes related to the uprising. Campos was sentenced to prison, as were many of his Confederates in the Jayuya uprising. Now, what about Collazo? Collazo was tried and sentenced to death. In those days, a death sentence for such a crime was mandatory. However, Latin American leaders throughout the Caribbean and South America asked President Truman to commute his sentence because they did not want to create a martyr that would pose a threat to their governments. Collazo did not beg for his life. He asked for no mercy whatsoever, even though his family did. President Truman, without comment, commuted Oscar Collazo's sentence to life imprisonment. He was released in the 1970s. He returned to a hero's welcome. And there ends the story of the assassination attempt on President Truman. Pedro Abizio Campos was sentenced to prison. He died in 1965. As for his legacy, it is mixed among Puerto Ricans. He has many admirers and critics. His admirers praise his advocating pride in Puerto Rican culture and identity, and his critics deride him as a terrorist troublemaker who was long on rhetoric and short on solutions. Although this event spelled the end of the attempt at the assassination of President Truman, it did not spell the advocacy for Puerto Rican independence. In fact, several years later, several Puerto Rican nationalists were arrested for trying to assassinate members of the U.S. Congress. However, relations between the United States and Puerto Rico have improved to some degree, or a great degree at least, and there's still a question of whether Puerto Rico should be a commonwealth as it is now, or should it be independent, or should it be the 51st U.S. state? Just as he did with Oscar Collazo, President Jimmy Carter commuted their sentences and allowed them to return to Puerto Rico. Carter's patronizing gesture toward the attackers did not prevent him from losing to Ronald Reagan in a landslide. Perhaps one lingering question about this entire event is this: when, if ever, is it justifiable to employ violence to promote a political or social cause? That's one question that perhaps will never be answered. So thanks for joining me for this edition of Crime Chronicles. I'm going to enjoy beautiful San Juan, Puerto Rico, and we hope you join us next time. Take care. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.